Welcome, and thank you for joining us at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. My name is Paul Coffey. I'm the Vice Provost and Dean of Community Engagement. I'm from the Office of Engagement, where we manifest the school's commitment to artist, designers, citizen. We're honored to be co-presenting tonight the struggle for justice, along with two incredible organizations, the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting and the Illinois Humanities. A few notes of housekeeping. Bathrooms are on the upper level, towards the back, elevators to your right, stairs to your left. Could you please silence your phones? At the end of today's presentation, we're going to have a question and answer. We've distributed some note cards for questions and answers. Tycoon will be moving through the crowd, collecting those cards, and we will present those cards to the moderator for discussion. Now, I'm particularly proud to introduce our president and my friend, the 15th executive and the first woman to lead the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Miss Alyssa Tenney.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome to everyone. We are thrilled to have you all here with us tonight. The School of the Art Institute of Chicago is pleased to partner once again with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and Illinois Humanities on tonight's program, The Struggle for Justice, the 1619 Project, and the Changing Narrative on Mass Incarceration. There is an idea contained in that title, the idea of the changing narrative, that I think is so powerful today. Last week, I attended a talk with the much-awarded journalist and essayist Ta-Nehisi Coates, who was discussing his first novel. Of the many powerful things he shared that night, perhaps the most powerful was his description of how we might, in effect, change the past. For while past events may be immutable, the stories we tell about them can be remade, expanded, and more frankly understood in our current moment. I thought tonight's distinguished speaker, whose 1619 project is clearly paradigm shifting, and our panelists, community leaders working towards a more just criminal justice system, might appreciate Coates' observation. Because as I think we all will affirm tonight, new narratives about our past can open up a changed narrative for our present and future. At SAIC, we know that how we understand our past and how we envision our future has always been a fundamental role that artists and designers play in our shared society. As communicators in a variety of media, all artists and designers are citizens in a global sense. Through their studies, our students are afforded opportunities to acknowledge the interconnectedness of all people and understand the potential influence their work can have on the world. The school's emerging citizen artists and designers get these experiences both in the classroom and beyond it. Experiences beyond the classroom include the work of the Office of Engagement, led by Paul Coffey, through the courses and community projects undertaken at our Home and Square satellite campus in North Lawndale, as well as other projects throughout the city. It also can be seen in the work of our faculty members, like Sarah Ross and Jason Boulware, who you will hear on tonight's panel. It also takes place through partnerships with other civically minded organizations, including our partners tonight, Illinois Humanities and the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. If you have not yet seen the amazing exhibition Envisioning Justice, which showcases Illinois Humanities' multi-year commitment to changing the incarceration narrative in Chicago, please do visit our Sullivan Galleries, that's just around the corner at 33 South State Street, before the exhibition closes on October 12th, so only a few days. And finally, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, John Sawyer.
Good evening. Okay, we're fixing. Good. Thank you, Alyssa, and to all our colleagues at SAIC, one of the newest members of our campus consortium, the network of over 36 universities, community colleges, and historically black colleges and universities who work with the Pulitzer Center to bring the issues our journalists cover onto their campuses. We've been so inspired by the work of SAIC in so many of the Chicago communities we seek to serve, from North Lawndale to the Illinois Youth Center to Stateville Prison, to the wonderful community of students right here at SAIC. A special thanks to our board member, Bill Bush, who has also served on the board of SAIC and whose support has made possible the great collaborations that we've been able to begin. More thanks to our fellow grantees of the Art for Justice Fund, the amazing initiative begun by Agnes Gund that has done so much to tackle the fundamental injustices in our system of mass incarceration. We're so honored that justice reform advocates Norris Henderson, Deb LaBelle, and Eric Alexander have been with us this week, sharing their urgently important work with our school and university partners across the city. And last, most important, I want to thank the New York Times, Times Magazine editor-in-chief Jake Silverstein, and the incomparable Nikole Hannah-Jones. The lead writer on the project most of us consider among the most consequential of any journalism initiative in American history. The subject of the 1619 Project is in fact American history itself. The truths in our story that we have distorted, buried, or willfully ignored. It is astonishing that so much of what the 1619 Project has to say about the role of slavery in American history comes as a revelation. But a revelation it clearly is, not least in holding up to unsparing light the myriad ways in which slavery and the experiences of enslaved people inform the institutions, laws, and culture of America today. One of those consequences of slavery is a system of mass incarceration unique to our country, a system that would be unimaginable absent the centuries of abuse, racism, privilege, and denial that brought it about. Our gathering tonight is a chance to reflect on that history and on this present moment. To hear from Nicole about 1619, and then from our panel of activists, artists, and journalists about how the history she reveals contributes to the evils of mass incarceration today. It is way past time to be holding such conversations. The Pulitzer Center is so grateful to the New York Times for the opportunity to be education partner on the 1619 Project, to Chicago Public Schools and CPS CEO Janice Jackson for helping us to get copies of the magazine and our curriculum into every high school across this city. And to all of you for being here tonight and for your commitment to a more just America in the years to come. And with that, Nikole Hannah-Jones.
I always get nervous. Okay, good. Felt like a spotlight. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out for what I'm sure is going to be a very important conversation about one of the most appalling aspects of American society, which is that we incarcerate more people in this country than any place in the world. And of course, a disproportionate number of those are the descendants of the enslaved. So I'm here tonight to talk to you a bit about the 1619 Project. And this is just kind of flipping you through the magazine right now. And I can tell you, none of us who worked on this expected that it would land in the world as it did. And if there are any journalists in here, I think there's one thing that this shows, is one, print is not dead if you produce something that is beautiful and powerful. We have a waiting list of about 30,000 that we cannot fill right now, and I've gotten a lot of angry emails about that, but it's not my fault. So what we endeavored to do, of course, with the 1619 Project was to radically shift the way that we think about not just our country and our founding, but about the role that Black Americans have played. And that's going to be kind of the center of my remarks today. What if I told you that the year 1619 is as important to the American story as the year 1776, and that America is a country born of both an idea and a lie? I personally have been obsessed with the year 1619 since I first saw that date on page 29 of the landmark book, Before the Mayflower. It was written by historian Lerone Bennett, and he wrote these words: "What seems unusual today is that no one sensed how extraordinary she really was, for few ships, before or since, have unloaded a more momentous cargo." I wonder how many in this room had heard of the year 1619 prior to the project. Because when you think about those words from Lerone Bennett, he is right, that there have been few ships that have unloaded such a momentous cargo, and yet that history has long been obscured. Like most Americans, I was taught very little about the institution of slavery. It, of course, explained the American presence of my family and all the Black people that I knew and saw. But like most Americans, I was taught largely that slavery was marginal to the American story, and that slavery only had to be mentioned in history books because we had to somehow explain the Civil War. But even in that oh-so-brief discussion, slavery was relegated largely to the backward South, and that narrative assured us that slavery had little to do with how our country developed, that it was a backwards economic system, that the good guys lived in the North, and that we fought a war that both was and wasn't about slavery. And then slavery ended, and the country moved on, and Martin Luther King had his dream, and we all sang Kumbaya. I've been thinking about the anniversary of 1619 pretty obsessively for the last 2 years. When I first read that date, it kind of hit me like a lightning bolt, because I couldn't believe that people of African descent had been here before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. And I understood that there was a reason why that part of the narrative, we all learned about Plymouth Rock, but we never learned about Port Comfort, Virginia. And I understood that in the creation of national memory, that was an intentional decision repeated again and again by the people who are trying to teach us how to think about ourselves as Americans. So as this anniversary was approaching, I just kept thinking that it was going to pass in most households without any notice, that most Americans would have no idea that there was an anniversary to be commemorated at all. And how many times in life do you get the opportunity to commemorate 400 years of anything, but particularly 400 years of something so consequential? So I felt that Americans should know this date, and that this should be the time where we actually assess what this date means. Because this date is the very reason that we exist today as a country. And we would not be the country that we are in ways both good and bad were it not for slavery. We all know, of course, that slavery was really about the theft of labor. Slavery made the colonies wealthy, and in fact, it made the colonies so wealthy that it gave these scrappy founders and colonists the actual belief that they could defeat one of the most powerful empires in the world. It gave them the confidence and the wealth to declare independence from England, because slavery at its height produced 2/3 of the world's cotton supply here in America. The value of the bodies of enslaved people was worth more than all of the railroads and factories in the nation combined. If you haven't read the project, I'm going to repeat that. The value of the human bodies of enslaved people was worth more than all of the railroads and the factories combined. This was not a backwards, not profitable institution. This is the institution on which the wealth of this country was built. I know you don't know whether to clap for that or just acknowledge it. I feel you. Slavery was so integral to our country that New York City, at the time of the Civil War, threatened to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy because more than half of all the exports that were coming out of the ports was enslaved grown cotton. And the financial sector that turned New York City into the financial capital of the world was built on the mortgaging, financing, insurance, and collateralizing of enslaved workers. The fate of the North wasn't tied up with the fate of slavery. I often wonder when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, where does one suppose that cotton that they were spinning in those textile mills came from? That cotton came from enslaved workers in the South. And those white textile workers did not own human beings, but their wages determined on other people owning human beings. There were no clean hands to be had. Enslaved people built the infrastructure of this country, particularly in the Northeast and the South. They built the railroads, the streets, the government buildings, including the White House and the Capitol building. They cleared the timbers across the Southeast that led to the expansion of slavery and allowed us to expand and grow both rice and cotton. In other words, it is the enslaved people who had an indelible impact on the nation's wealth and allowed us to pay off our war debts after the Revolutionary War and allowed us to go on to become a superpower. For instance, the second richest man in the country in the early 1800s was a slave trader who lived in Rhode Island, who never owned a human being himself, but simply sent the ships that took us from Africa and brought us here and sold us and was able to make lavish profits and build the university that's in Rhode Island now. So we know about the financial impact of slavery, but I'm actually much more interested in a point that is much less well understood and almost universally overlooked when we're taught about slavery and the Black presence in America. And it is that Black people have played perhaps the most vital role throughout this country's history, in that it has been we who have been the perfecters of this democracy. You see, the words of the country's founding documents were false when they were written. When Thomas Jefferson wrote in that room in Philadelphia that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Some of the most famous words in the English language. Many of us don't even have to read the words. We know them by memory. But what we're not told is as he's writing those words, there's an enslaved young man sitting at his side, and that enslaved young man is the brother of his wife. It is his own family. And he knows as he writes those words that his own family, as well as 1/5 of the country, would enjoy none of those rights and liberties. That 1/5 of our country at our founding lived in absolute bondage, and that in fact, our country was not founded as a democracy, but a slaveocracy. We were a country ruled by slave owners. And it's not incidental that 10 of the first 12 presidents were enslavers who got their wealth and their privilege by operating forced labor camps where Black people were forced to work. But even though the founders set up a decidedly undemocratic constitution, a constitution that if you read it before amended, actually denies the right to vote to the majority of citizens, Women could not vote under that Constitution. Native Americans could not vote under that Constitution. And certainly Black people could not vote under that Constitution. But Black people responded to those words with a belief that those words were to be made manifest. And they responded by fighting for the universal equality that the founders wrote but didn't believe in. From the moment when Crispus Attucks, a man who was a fugitive from slavery, who himself was not free, became the first person to die for the American Revolution, to Black Lives Matter protests today, it is Black people who have fought to make the ideals in the Constitution a reality. Not only fighting wars abroad to bring democracy other places, but then returning home and having to fight our own countrymen in hopes that we could bring democracy here. It is during Reconstruction that public education begins in the South. There was no public education until the formerly enslaved demanded public education for their own children and set up a system of public education that benefited poor white children as well. The amendments ending slavery, providing equal protection of the law and citizenship and universal suffrage, and the first civil rights legislation in this country all come from the struggle of Black Americans to make the ideals of our country real. And 100 years later, Black Americans were still struggling for those rights that they had gained in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The civil rights struggle of the 1960s would set the stage for all other civil rights battles. So when you look at immigration rights, gay rights, women's rights, disability rights, all of those rights come because of the Black resistance struggle. When Black people got civil rights laws passed, they were never just to benefit Black Americans. They were always to benefit all Americans. And if you read the Civil Rights Act, they ban discrimination not just based on race, but on national origin, on religion, and on gender. In fact, when gay rights advocates successfully advocated that, the Constitution required that gay people be allowed to marry, it was under the 14th Amendment, passed to ensure equal protection under the law for those who had been born into slavery, that they made that successful argument. So I think we should keep that in mind, that those who have been the most marginalized have been the ones who have fought the hardest to bring equality for other marginalized people in this nation, even though oftentimes we fought those battles alone. We are a unique people because we came here under unique circumstances. We are the only people outside of Native Americans who did not choose to be a part of the United States. And we are the only people who were forced across an ocean to be here. We were the only people who were completely severed from our native lands and our native tongues and our native religions and our cultures. As I write in my essay, our people were born on the water in those slave ships, where we were forced to leave everything we knew behind and try to find something new here. And as sociologist Glenn Bracey wrote, it was out of the ashes of white denigration that we gave birth to ourselves. That's a beautiful thing, right? The enslaved created themselves anew here, isolated from both our native lands and forcibly segregated from mainstream white culture in a way that no other group in this country has experienced. We actually created out of that circumstance the only true unique American culture that exists. You could say that because of this, because we are a people who were created on these lands, that we are the most American of all Americans. When the world hears quintessential American music, it is our voice that they hear. Our unique style, our avant-garde flair, came from enslaved people's determination to exert our own individuality in a system of chattel slavery that tried to shear all sense of our humanity. When you look at Black naming practices, something that so many of us like to malign, the fact that so many marginalized Black people choose not a European name nor an African name for their children, but a name that they created here in America. We malign that, but that is an act of resistance, and that is an act of self-determination, and those names are beautiful. The things that we have looked down upon Black communities for are actually signs of our resilience and our determination to thrive and to create our own culture in the most brutal of circumstances. Black people, in order to justify slavery and original sin, have from the beginning been treated as a problem, as something that needs to be removed or solved. If you go to Google right now and you Google the Negro Problem or Black Problem, you will find an unending amount of research and think pieces and articles that are attempting to resolve the problem of Black Americans. But if you read the 1619 Project, then you understand that Black people have never been the problem. That any one of us who can tick off the stereotypes that we hear, the statistics all the time about out-of-wedlock births, about incarceration rates, about crime rates, about college attendance rates, about unemployment rates, that not a single one of these things are surprising in a country built on racial caste that didn't even believe that Black people could be full citizens until 1968. So what if instead of thinking about Black people as the problem, in this 400th year, we finally started seeing that Black people are, in fact, and have always been the solution. I'm gonna wrap up by telling you guys a little story. I grew up about 4 hours from here in a small working class town called Waterloo, Iowa. My family came on the same migration that brought most of the Black people in Chicago here from Mississippi. And I like to say, we got on, my grandmother and her 3 young children got on the Illinois Central line, and we were so country, we didn't realize we had got off too early. We thought we had hit the big city. But for that, I would be a Chicagoan, but it just wasn't meant to be. But my grandmother was born in Greenwood, and Greenwood was the most lynchingest county in the most lynchingest state in the country. More people were lynched in Greenwood than any single county in the United States, and more people were lynched in Mississippi, Black people, than in any county, in any state in the United States. And she grew up in a place of complete apartheid. My father was literally born on a cotton plantation because Black people could not go to the hospital to deliver their children. My grandmother, I am just touching everything up here, sorry. My grandmother never got to live her dreams, and she never got to see me get to where I am. She, like so many of our ancestors, though, bore what they did so that we, the descendants, might be here today. And though so many of our ancestors did not live to see this, we 40 million descendants who came from that 20 that grew to 4 million by the end of the Civil War, that grew to 40 million now. We are the living testimony of our ancestors and the strength and the resilience and the determination that this country would be ours and we would make this country live up to our ideals. This project, above all else, is an attempt to set the record straight, to reframe our historical narrative, and instead of marginalizing slavery and treating Black people as the bottom, to instead center slavery as it should be, and the contributions of Black Americans, and to place them not just in the center of American history, but in the center of what we tell ourselves about who we are. And you can see this in the project, that nothing about American life, this is not a history, it is about the modern and living legacy, that you can look at things from traffic jams in Atlanta, or why we consume so much sugar, why millions of Americans die for lack of health care, the very geography of our cities and the brutality of our system of incarceration. Our very democracy itself would not exist without Black Americans, and almost nothing has been left untouched by that decision in 1619, just 12 years after the English landed Jamestown, to introduce slavery into the colonies. Our project argues that August of 1619 is our true founding, not 1776, and that Black Americans, as much as those men whose images are cast in alabaster in our nation's capital, are this nation's true founding fathers. And in doing so, we hope that finally, in this 400th year, the 1619 Project will force us to tell the truth about who we are as a nation and who we can be. Because until we tell the truth, until we confront what we have done, we will never make it right. And so it is time to stop hiding our sins, but to confront them, and then work to do justice for not just those who are the descendants, but for our whole society. I thank you so much for joining me tonight, and I look forward to the conversation that continues. This is where we start. Thank you.
Nicole, thank you so much. And I really just, I'm digesting. I know you weren't clapping for me. I really want to just take a minute to say one thing, which is I really want to thank Pulitzer and SAIC for hosting this free program in this extraordinary space and letting us be together. So I really want to thank everybody just one more time. My name is Gabrielle Lyon. I'm the Executive Director of Illinois Humanities. We've been around about 45 years, and there's much work to be done. We do things that help us to be more human and to be more humane. We give grants, we run education programs, but most of all, we try to do this. And I really want to carry forward something that Nicole is really charging us to do, and which I think is very important. Shifting the narrative, changing the way we understand ourselves cannot happen simply by reading the extraordinary compendium that is 1619. And so at Illinois Humanities, we really believe that changing the narrative means that we collectively have to name the moment and to bring in new language. And I think that's what's so special about this program, and to really trace and make the living connection between the history and this moment and the struggle around mass incarceration. I think Envisioning Justice is a project that Alyssa made mention of. It's something we've been involved in for the last 2 years at Illinois Humanities, working closely with some of the communities most devastatingly impacted by mass incarceration. And one of the things that we've learned, if nothing else, is that we will never be able to change the narrative, to transform the narrative, if we don't make time and space to come together as a public, and that it's part of our job as a public to actually have those conversations. It's going to be our collective efforts, our radical shifts in understanding. And that's what I really call us to do as we have this next part of the program. Because being here together tonight, we become a public by being here. We would not be here tonight without the 1619 Project. We would not be here tonight without the vision and generosity. But it's not just about what we are doing here tonight in this moment. It's about our work, our collective imagination for how we're going to shift that narrative. And so we're extraordinarily lucky to have the panelists that are going to come up on stage now join us. And so I encourage you, as you meet them, as we hear from them, to think about what it means to imagine together. And as we do every day at Illinois Humanities, really think about what it means for us to shift that narrative by being a public. Joining me on stage, firstly, is Kristen Mack, who will be moderating our conversation. Kristen Mack is a journalist herself. She's a communicator by practice, and she's the interim director of communications at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. And I would be remiss if I did not make sure to mention that the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation have made extraordinary efforts both to reduce mass incarceration and also illuminate through the humanities and arts. Thank you very much. What is so inhumane about it? Kristen's going to moderate. She's got some questions for our panelists. I just want to remind you, if you have those index cards, please write some questions down. We'll be collecting those. Jason Beware. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Jason is a producer and visual artist working in video and acrylic mediums. He's also a faculty member right here at SAIC. Aren't you lucky? But his work, it is, we're all lucky actually. His work centers around youth incarceration and its effect on the communities, as well as what it's going to take for juvenile justice transformation. He's a recipient of the IYC Chicago Volunteer of the Year Award right here in 2019, and the 2019 State of Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice Volunteer of the Year, and thank you for that service. Next, we have Sarah Ross, who's right here. Sarah, will you give a wave? Sarah and Jason work together. Sarah is an artist and educator whose own work is centered on the spatial politics of race, gender, class, and control. She co-founded an extraordinary effort, the Prison and Neighborhood Arts Project, known fondly as PNAP. And it's a cultural project that brings together artists, writers, scholars in and outside Stateville Prison to create public art projects. Sarah has worked closely with local artists, activists, lawyers, torture survivors, and scholars on the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, a cultural project and campaign that organized and won reparations for and with survivors of Chicago police torture. And it is another extraordinary thing, along with 1619, that CPS has incorporated it into its entire curriculum. So we've got an extraordinary effort underway. Sarah's also on faculty at SAIC. You're getting gold stars all the way, Alyssa. I also want to introduce Norris Henderson. He's the founder and executive director, and he has been focused on reforming the notorious Orleans Parish Prison, OPP. He himself was wrongfully incarcerated for 27 years. He's got firsthand experiences of the racism and brutality of the criminal justice system, and he uses these experiences to address the needs of communities of color across Louisiana and well beyond. In fact, he's inspired many of us to think in new ways about how we can be part of a stronger coalition. Since his release in 2003, he's spent time with years of self-taught legal expertise and community organizing skills. He's on the board, I am so sorry, I just lost my place. He serves on a number of organizations' board of directors, including Family and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children, and acts as board president of the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights. And our last panelist tonight is Brian Frank. He's a San Francisco native, and he's focused on social documentary projects across the Americas focused on cultural identity, social inequality, violence, workers' rights, and the environment. He's had tremendous recognition, especially for his 2-year project, Downstream, Death of the Colorado, and he's part of the permanent collection in the United States Library of Congress. You can use Google to find more of their work. These words don't do justice to what kinds of art they have put into the world, and I'm really, really excited to turn it over to Kristen so we can get into the good stuff of conversation. Don't forget to write your questions down, and at about 7:35, we're gonna bring some of those questions forward and give them to you, Kristen, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabe. We got to hear from Nicole about how deeply personal the 1619 project is, and we heard a little bit about your bios, but I want to hear from you all directly about how your work is personal to you and how your pursuits are personal to you. So why don't we start here?
Can I roll? Sure. So I had an opportunity to TA with a brilliant professor named Terza Even on the social practices class. And Terza is amazing. And one of the first films that she shows is called The Farm. And it's about the Angola prison and how the prison went from a plantation to a prison almost overnight. And it really spoke to the heart of the 13th Amendment for me. It's just those few words, except for punishment of a crime. And that really rang true for me. And after we began to visit the IYC prison, and I got to really meet the youth that are there, and I got to spend time with them and see their brilliance and see their engagement and see their talent, really just kind of build this affinity for them, and it becomes, it becomes personal. You meet people on a personal level, you share with them, and they share with you, and that never really leaves you. And so it's been personal from day one for me.
Sure. So for me personally, I began pursuing a criminal justice story for about 2 years ago, and I've been focused pretty heavily on that. It began with me. I actually was doing a project about inmate firefighters, but I ended up at a juvenile camp, and I was about to have a young boy, and it was a kind of a crazy period in my life, and I started seeing myself in these guys that were locked up in the last juvenile labor camp in California. And the reason I saw myself in them was because I was incarcerated as a juvenile myself, and that wasn't something I was even comfortable sharing until recently. But I didn't want, I started thinking about this boy that I was bringing into the world, and I started thinking about my decisions and how I didn't want my son to be caught in the same traps that I was caught in and that all of these young men had been caught in. And so, for me, this work's very personal, and it's been something that has given me a voice and an ability to speak out about kind of some of the injustices that I have faced and the things that I've learned through being caught under the boot of the criminal justice system myself.
How does that allow you to connect with the people who you are engaged in with your work?
One of the things when I first went to the juvenile camp especially was the guards thought that they were going to have to worry about me, and it took a matter of minutes before I was kind of connecting on a very personal level with these guys because we had similar shared experiences. It allows me to connect because I get it. I know the pain. I know what it's like to call my mom from jail. I know what it's like to have that trauma affect my view of everything around me. And I think that's something that you can't make up, and people that I work with, they know that immediately when they meet me.
For me, my personal experience was my experience while I do this work. Being incarcerated in that farm, I'm in that documentary, The Farm, and being on this plantation and listening at Nicole talk, I was just kind of like reflecting of all the things that we experience in that environment. And so, one of the things I was sharing with some folks yesterday in Statesville is that I do this work primarily because of that experience. It was because of that negative experience that I do this work. And this has become my life's work, and it's primarily because I don't want to see nobody ever have to experience, what incarceration looks like. I don't care if it's for 10 minutes. I don't think nobody needs to be in a cage and literally thrown away and just being a castaway, that you have no value. And so the work I do is kind of like to raise the voices of not just folks incarcerated, but formerly incarcerated folks across this country, and to demonstrate to people what our work is. It's kind of like what Nicole was saying about this struggle for us started a long time ago. And it manifested in different iterations of everything, but for anybody who have ever seen The Farm or saw Lester Host's piece about life in prison, it's still a plantation. It's still a plantation. So don't, folks get mesmerized by the fact that what incarceration looks like today. It's still slavery, just by another name.
For me, I feel like I came to this through doing domestic violence work. I worked with women, often sex workers, between art schools, and so in that time I became really interested in how the role of representation in producing criminalization. And also, as a white woman, I became clearly aware of how white women, the figure of white women is incredibly important in this history of producing criminalization. And so I think that a series of work around those issues made me think a lot about the role of incarceration as it relates to the figure of white women, and in particularly how it plays out in terms of domestic violence, you can chart these history of laws around domestic violence that seek to lock up people longer and longer, but don't actually address issues of harm. And so this is why I'm continuing, yeah.
The 1619 Project was intended as a reframing of our country's history, a corrective force that recognizes 1619 as our true founding. The arts, journalism, and social movements are powerful tools in shifting narratives. How do each of you, through your work, ask people to reevaluate the stories and narratives that they've been told? Sarah, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think that I do that most with many other people who I work with as part of PNAP by collaborating with folks inside to tell their own stories, and then trying to connect those stories to policy and movements happening outside of prison. And I think that one thing that's useful or that we are reminded of often is that the stories are actually out there. People's moms have been fighting for them since they've been locked up. You can listen to, R&B music and rap music and poetry and art and see for so long people have been narrating the crisis of incarceration. So I think that part of our work also too is to think about how our stories are heard, or what kinds of gatekeeping is happening that delegitimizes those stories, and how we need to, really sort of bust open those gates to see that work as work that we need to listen to and we need to hear in order to make changes.
Say more about that, the gatekeeping.
Well, there's so much to say. I think that in the last 15 years, there's an explosion of books, academic texts around incarceration. And I've even heard people say something like, of course there's this crisis of incarceration that 2 million people are locked up, and why didn't we know about it before? But people were saying things all along. And so I think that it's like in the academy, in journalism and other forms, that actually hearing and giving space and listening to people in struggle has not happened. So in particular, I can say something about the work around the survivors of police torture. For years, their parents and people in the neighborhoods were talking about the torture that was happening for years. And and because no one did anything, that went on for 20 years. And more and more people were tortured, and still we have this long legacy of police violence in the city. So I think that it really is incumbent upon us, educators, et cetera, to look outside of sort of maybe what we might understand as like formal institutional writing, et cetera, to seek stories that can really teach us from many points of view.
I just want to jump on that a little bit. One of the great things about the school is that it's so international. And so my class is typically full of people that are from not only Chicago, but London and China and South Korea. And in our class, we're talking about mass incarceration, and we're wrestling with it, right? And I feel like it's important to have these conversations with an international body so they know that we are dealing with this. We're trying to have these conversations. Though they are difficult, they need to be had. And I think having them in the classroom where you have an open space where you can understand, where are people coming from and why there's so much strife and things. The classroom in an international body setting has been really helpful in terms of getting that conversation, that dialogue going.
Did you want to say something before I ask another question? Norris?
I think one of the real narrative shifts is that language itself. And it's particularly around folks who have been in prison. The language for years has been you're ex-convict, you're ex-felon. And so a friend of mine, Eddie Ellis, coined the letter And he asked people not to address us in that manner. And so we adopted this phrase of formerly incarcerated to humanize people. You know, it's just people who've come in contact with the criminal justice system. And really, the language is shifting now because people are saying people have come in contact with the criminal unjust system. And people are starting to acknowledge that now. And for years, people wouldn't acknowledge. And I really appreciate what Sarah just said about how people's family has been struggling for years, you know, being that voice in the wilderness, crying out, something unjust has happened to my family member, and we've all turned a deaf ear. But now, because it's happening so frequently, people are like becoming appalled at how this system has actually operated. And I'm kind of like reminded this morning, I was reading an article, yesterday the United States Supreme Court was hearing a case out of Louisiana about non-unanimous jury verdicts. This has been on the books in Louisiana since the 1890s. It's kind of like Jim Crow's last stand. But it was all built on racism to take away the power of black people in the state of Louisiana. So when Nicole was talking, I was like just listening, saying, oh, all these dots are still connecting, but now people are listening. The person who asked the most profound question yesterday of the justices was Brett Kavanaugh. And he asked the Solicitor General from Louisiana, who was arguing that if y'all rule this thing unconstitutional, 35,000 people are going to get out of prison. And he was questioning, well, what's more valuable, upholding this racist law? And he owned that this was born out of racism. When this law was put in place, our Constitution literally said that we're creating this law to maintain the white supremacy in this state. And so if you think of all the people, there's 100,000 African-American registered voters. As soon as the Constitution changed, it dropped down to 10,000. And then we became invisible because it didn't matter if we had the right to serve on the jury, because two or one of y'all wouldn't make a difference. Because those 10 white folks, once they voted, it was a wrap. And so it's how we are kind of like starting really now to acknowledge the injustices that this country has brought to bear. And I'm excited when Sarah calls out this thing about the privilege that white women have in America, you know, is that it's hard for anything to change until white women get in front of it. And then so when this question comes up about how the narrative shift has to happen, people got to own this. I don't care how much Nicole push out this theory of 1619, somebody gonna say she's just an angry black woman. But until white folks start owning this history about what they stood by and watched happen to us, is when this whole narrative is gonna change. And so this has got to be a collective process. This is not going to be the advocates who've been impacted by these systems, the historians telling the history. And one thing she kept saying was, she just kept talking about truth. And one of my mentors always told me that truth has a way of finding favor or disfavor. Some people hear the truth, they're going to applaud. Some people hear that same truth, and they're going to get rocks in their jaws. And so that's what we have to start doing. We have to own the truth, be it for us or against us. And that's when we're going to start having this narrative shift in the way that we need it to happen.
One of the ways that I've tried to approach the narrative that I see, which is one full of stereotypes, is basically just by photographing folks that are incarcerated as if they are normal people like you and me. And that sounds really basic, but you would be amazed when I go into classrooms, for instance, and ask people like, we'll ask students, what do you think of when I say inmate or convict, right? When I use these powerful negative words, and they consistently regurgitate the same stereotypical visuals. And when I hear those words, even though I don't think that way, I still think of these negative images right away. So I try to, because I've been so indoctrinated, right? So visually, I just try to work with folks as though they are folks like you and me, and that's the main thing I try to do visually, to change that narrative about what it means to be incarcerated. There's all kinds of folks that are incarcerated, you know what I mean? And the other thing that I try to do to change the narrative a little bit, where I can, is to work with people that are either incarcerated or formerly incarcerated in order to learn how to tell their own stories, because something that I think is part of the problem is this just colonial history of journalism where we parachute into places, tell stories that from a colonial and racist perspective, from a neighborhood that we know nothing about, and then we just get the same nonsense over and over again. So to teach folks to tell their own stories has been just something that I have tried to do firsthand.
I think you all have each touched on this a little bit, and if you can speak to it more if you'd like, is this notion of how you center the people whose stories you are telling in your work, how you think about that as you are telling stories, and how you put people's lived experiences at the center of your work. Again, you each spoke to it a little bit, but if there's something more you would like to say about that.
I'll say something, and that is the basis of the project, Prison and Neighborhood Arts Project, when we got started, was both to work with folks inside to tell stories, but also to do it in a collaborative manner, which is not to say not to center folks' voice, but rather to try to bring different experiences into the room and make work that can be shown in different contexts. And I think that through that collaboration, there's a learning on both sides, and then that's been a really important way to transform the work. But also, too, one of the things that I know, I might get in trouble for saying this, but I feel like one of the things that I know is that sometimes there's exhibitions in the world that is like artwork made by people in prison, which is great. Love it. But that's not what we wanted to do. We actually wanted to build work that was made collaboratively by researching topics together and producing knowledge from the inside to share with folks on the outside, because we were worried and thought critically that work that was art by people in prison would continue to isolate people there, right? And instead to think more like poetry by people in prison or scholarly writing by scholars. There's tons of scholars in prison. Should be in any journal. It should be alongside my work and your work and your work, and to really to foreground that, because we really were trying to think critically about how when you go into a prison to teach a class, it's just easy for that work to stay there. So how does it get into the world and get into the world in a way that is not continually isolated and marginalized? Yeah.
I was with Sarah yesterday in Stateville in her class. And I think one of the things about how we center those voices is we got to allow those voices to be heard. A lot of time we smother those voices by suggesting to folks what's best for them. And just like you're saying again, it's like hearing people, encouraging people to tell their story. People have been marginalized for so long, they're afraid to tell their story because they've been told nobody wants to hear your voice. Mm-hmm. And so the challenge of centering them, my encouragement to all of them, like I told the guys yesterday, no successful movement in this country was successful without the voices of the people who are directly impacted. We're not going to change mass incarceration in this country without the voices of people who have been impacted by this system. They have the narrative. They can tell the story. They can collectivize their stories. The story from Chicago and the story from New Orleans is all the same. When I was in that classroom yesterday in Stateville, they were different faces, but those voices were folks that I left in Angola. Mm-hmm. It's the same narrative. The thing is that folks from behind them walls and folks in the street, I just left meeting with the Chicago 400. Those folks seem invisible to people because nobody wants to center their voice. The folks who are working directly with them wants to center their voices, but nobody is there to help center their voices because there's always that stigma attached. Like he's saying, oh, that's the ex-con, that's the felon, oh, that's the guy that's on the register. We have to stop seeing people based upon that single worst thing they ever done in their life. Because I guarantee you, if I ask people in this room to raise their hand about something they done that they're not proud of, I guarantee you'd be standing room only. And I see the nods in the crowd. And so we can't suppress people's voices based upon, I should tell guys in the prison, they should complain every day about wanting to throw somebody else under the bus. And I would literally say, ain't nobody in this prison for slipping on a banana peeling. Nobody. So the pot can't call the skillet black. And I think until we allow people to kind of like start speaking in their own voices, there were some talented young men I met yesterday. And for us to always refer to them as that this is the art that's coming out of prison, no. The only thing that prison does, solitude breeds thinkers. There's a lot of thinkers behind these walls, folks with a lot of talent that just not given the opportunity, afforded the opportunity to elevate their voice. And even for folks who work on their behalf, I have to tell people all the time, people say, I want to help you. And I used to ask them, define help to me. What is help? And they say, you know, we want to do this. That's not the help. Help is what I need, not what you want to give me. That's what we have to always be mindful of. So when we are lifting the voices and centering our folks, it's the help that they need, not what we want to give.
I think just to piggyback on that, what's nice about working in IYC, this youth facility, is that we're able to provide a way for youth to amplify their voices when they're on the outside. So we work on projects inside together as a collaboration, but more than that, we're trying to teach youth ways to amplify their voice when they're outside. So when we're in and we're talking about here's how to use cameras and sound equipment and whatnot, when they're outside, they're not, I just got out of IYC, it's, I'm trying to work to be a sound engineer. I'm a director, right? These are the titles we want them to embody, and not just, I just got recently released from IYC, because that only is going to get them back into IYC. And I feel like if we're able to provide tools that are useful to them, that they can understand how to use and how to tell this story to a larger audience, I feel like that's when you start to see change at the community level.
So it takes a couple of things, I think, to center and amplify some of these voices of the young men that I generally work with. The first is follow through. I have to be able to keep working with guys that all have special, unique needs, honestly, and take the time to not only be an educator, but to be a friend and a mentor. That's one thing I have to do. And, the other thing is that it takes collaboration, it takes partnerships. It's one thing for me to go and teach a workshop, and that's great. And I think that it is absolutely valuable to work with people that maybe have just never been told that they're talented and amazing at something, and they are, and just that simple act maybe just, is something good for them. But also to not only do that, but to follow through and get those voices out in the world, which is honestly the really hard part sometimes. I've worked with a couple of my students to get their work published, right? That is the hardest part of the battle. There's still entrenched gatekeepers. We talked a little bit about the gatekeepers. There's people that are at journalism institutions that are terrified by change, honestly, and it's scary to bring these voices that are outside of the fold, even if these folks mean well at a level of at the highest levels of journalism institutions. Even if journalism institutions are diversifying at the lower ranks, they're not diversifying at those higher ranks, and so those decisions still end up. It still ends up being an archaic system in a lot of ways, and they don't want to change. But there are people fighting that fight inside of publications, and I just think it's important to get those voices, not just you have to get those voices out there into the mainstream media too, so that these new voices can be heard.
So Brian Stevenson, the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative and a MacArthur Fellow, wrote a piece in the 1619 Project connecting slavery to today's system of mass incarceration. The headline of his piece was, "Slavery gave America a fear of Black people and a taste for violent punishment. Both still define our criminal justice system." The piece is powerful. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to. I'm going to give you a quick excerpt that will frame my next question. So he wrote, "Laws governing slavery were replaced with Black codes governing free Black people, making the criminal justice system central to new strategies of racial control. Hundreds of people after the arrival of enslaved Africans, hundreds of years after the arrival of enslaved Africans, a presumption of danger and criminality still follows Black people everywhere. New language has emerged for non-crimes that have replaced Black codes. Driving while Black, sleeping while Black, sitting in a coffee shop while Black. Inside courtrooms, the problem gets worse. Racial disparities in sentencing are found in almost every crime category. Black defendants are 22 times more likely to receive the death penalty for crimes whose victims are white rather than Black, a type of bias the Supreme Court has declared inevitable." So let's take a quick step back and think about the title of today's program, Struggle for Justice, 1619, and the Changing Narrative on Mass Incarceration. I'm sure if I asked each of you what the narrative is on mass incarceration today, you probably would have a different answer. So rather than ask that question, I'm going to ask it this way. Is the narrative really changing?
It is starting to shift, and it's starting to shift because of people like Brian. And I think the reason it's starting to shift, because Brian challenges people. Brian challenges people to be proximate, to be close to the problem. You can't solve the problem or even resolve the problem if you're not close to it. You don't recognize it. And I encourage everybody in this room, if you haven't been to the Legacy Museum, you need to go. Because that's a walk through history. And when Nicole was talking about that county in Mississippi, to see those images with all those names on them and realizing this was man inhumanity to man. And to have to be, again, close to it. The narrative is shifting because my first thought when I went there, I was like, Montgomery, Alabama? Brian, you pull off a wing dang duty. Yeah, I don't know how they, really, I'm like, I'm from the South, so I'm like, I don't know how these white folks let you do this. This is like in their face. This is literally in their face. But the real challenge is that for every monument that's hanging, there's one outside. And his challenge is for all these places where you all then killed these people, come and get your baggage. Because here's one outside that you can kind of like this, you want to memorialize these things with Confederate monuments and stuff, come and get this. So the narrative is shifting. I mean, Michelle kind of like started the ball with the new Jim Crow, everybody's picking up on it. And I would venture to say that 1619 is going to make people dig a little deeper because this is the history lesson. Everything else is kind of like in our lifetime. This was before our lifetime. But this kind of like set the tempo for where we're at today. So I trust that the narrative is that little pendulum, kind of like moves. I'm gonna give you a different example of how I think the narrative is really shifting. There's a group of formerly incarcerated folks, of which I'm one, that we're hosting a town hall, a presidential town hall, 2 weeks from now in Philadelphia. inside of a prison. So if that ain't a narrative shift, I don't know what is. You know, that directed impacted people from top to bottom running this show, that paid for it out of our pockets. And so that is a shift in the sense of y'all talking to everybody about everything. But if you want to talk about criminal justice, you need to talk to people who've been impacted by these systems, about the rule of law that y'all have put in place. And so I believe, honestly, that it's shifting, but it's going to take a lot of heavy lifting from folks like y'all in the room. Folks in this room are connected to a lot of folks. And it's going to take us educating those folks we're connected to about why we stand in the spaces that we stand in, why we take the positions that we take, and to be supportive of the work that going on with educating these juveniles in prison, educating these adults that's in prison, but even question why in some places, like in Stateville, they didn't want to educate the people in prison. And so the narrative has to shift in a way about, put myself in that position. If I was there, what would I want to happen? And so I think the shift is happening. This is a part of the shift. This event is a narrative shift. This wouldn't have probably happened 10 years ago. The collaboration of this event happening. And so it's moving, and so sometimes we look for that monumental moment and say, oh, it happened on this particular day. No, this thing ebbs and flows. And we're going to wake up one morning, we're going to realize, you know what? Man, we done it. You know, so the narrative shift is happening. Sometimes people are like, it's not happening fast enough. But trust me, it took us 400 years to get where we at. We ain't going to change this overnight. But until we start having these conversations, and I call them CBAs, you know, the collective behavior conversations, until we start having them collective behavior conversations with each other and with folks who position may be totally at opposite to us, is when the narrative shift starts to happen.
I think the other part of that shift is not just the people that are going into facilities to work, but the people that are working in facilities every day. I'm fortunate I have people like Michael Bird and Tom Hurley here who work in this youth facility, and it's their efforts in seeing the best in these guys that's really going to shift, you know, the true nature of the narrative. And I think it's the work every day that they're doing that really has like long-term effects. You know, reaching guys and saying, you know what, I know that you're better than this, right? I'm going to hold you to a higher standard because I believe that you are, you know, you are a good and solid man who can make a positive impact on your community. And without those voices in those facilities, I don't think that we've seen, you know, the movement that we have. It's people like them that are making things possible.
What about on the other end with the formerly incarcerated coming out and their role in that conversation? I didn't mean to interrupt what you were about to say.
I feel like Norris could speak more to that, but also too in Chicago we have an amazing group of people in the city who are formerly incarcerated who are doing really important policy work and work in neighborhoods. So, you know, I'm grateful to know some of those people and really learn from them. But I also want to just lift up one sort of term and history that critical resistance has put forward, and that is the idea of abolition. And really, it's I think Black feminists that have really articulated this and led the way in shaping what that means. And I think that that you know, you can get some clicks in the room, yay, abolition. But I think that that what it also means is that it's about building up our communities so that people have resources. So when harm happens, that we have places to go and ways to solve harm. Because sort of back to the domestic violence issue is like, you know. In the 90s, we put all these resources, the crime bill put all these resources to the Violence Against Women Act, which was good, but it also gave all these resources to policing, which police are not trained to deal with harm, right? They're really not trained to deal with the kinds of harm that we're asking them to deal with. And even our prosecutor, Kim Fox, said this very thing, that, you know, her office is dealing with things that are not, you know, real crimes, right? It's like, you know, there's much deeper problems there, like drug addiction, like mental health issues, right? So I think that the narrative change can also include abolition, which is about building up our communities and funding resources so that we're not relying on punishment systems as a solutions to harm.
I've definitely seen the narrative shift pretty drastically, I think, in the last couple years alone. I wouldn't have been comfortable sharing my stories of dealings with the criminal justice system until recently, honestly, and I think that has been due to an attitude shift in general, just in the public in general, and seeing, and people being able to understand that I honestly was a victim of the criminal justice system myself, and instead of being ostracized immediately and being labeled as other and someone different because of things that I did when I was a child, honestly, that's been a drastic shift recently. And I've seen other shifts because I go into different institutions all the time. And when I had gone into institutions previous, I would have one-on-one conversations with folks, and they would be very guarded about maybe things that were seen as too progressive, words that were too progressive, like ideas that were too progressive in that facility. And just in the last few years, I've seen folks just be like, hey, man, this is actually how it is. Like, we need to be more positive in here with folks. These are, and I've really seen that firsthand. So that is actually one of the most positive things that I have to say about the criminal justice system, is that I do see change happening as we speak.
Sarah, can you touch on the idea of restorative justice and what role that plays in this conversation for the struggle for justice, and in particular something that you touched on a little bit earlier about racial healing as part of this conversation? I know that's a lot.
Well, it is because I don't practice restorative justice, but I know it from afar, and it is a practice that's been put into place in some of the juvenile justice facilities and also in schools. And I think that the attempt there is to work with people to get a sense of accountability, I think that anything that's going to divert resources from punishment as solutions to harm would be a starting point. There's people who are also practicing like there's all kinds of like words in here that have differences that are really important in particular, and people like Miriam Kaba, who used to live here in Chicago but now lives in New York, really dives deep into what transformative justice looks like and how those are community processes are long and take time, and it's kind of just the opposite of what the criminal justice system does. People who are sitting in Cook County right now waiting for their trial, I'm sure they would totally disagree with me, because there's ways in which the criminal legal system is slow and brutal. But also, real healing practices are slow and take time and attention. And I think that any kind of work that we're talking about here has to be, racial healing or racial justice. I don't even know if I can say the word healing, because how do you heal from this, So I think it maybe is a reckoning. I'm not sure what the language is. I don't know that I'm the person to say. But I think that it has to be, you can't go into a class in Stateville Prison and wonder if this is not a racial project, There's probably no other college class in the city of Chicago that is all black men, except for in prison, and that's a problem. That's a tragedy, right? And so I think that, Nicole's work is all her work around education reporting has just been so really important to me, and the 1619 Project, sort of brings that home, and I think that kind of history is a start to think about, like I said, I'm not sure if it's healing, but a kind of reckoning.
Just a quick reminder, if you want to submit a question, that they will be collecting them, and we're going to start our Q&A in a few minutes here. So please feel free to pass them to the aisle if you'd like to ask our panelists any questions. Does anyone else want to speak to that notion of restorative justice and healing?
You know, I think a lot starts with the youth. I think in order to heal in the community, you have to heal the youth. And I think that begins with acknowledging that there's a trauma. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about the IYC facility is that they acknowledge that. And they have people on site that are counselors and therapists, and they're trying to acknowledge this trauma that's happened. And I think that once you kind of acknowledge that and you begin to deal with it, then you can have, you know, some sense of healing. And it's something that I think IYC is proud of, and I'm, you know, proud of as well.
I think the piece about the healing part is about how people envision people who have been harmed. You know, because most folks who are in prison have harmed somebody, but most of them have been harmed. And I remember year before last, right after the Miller decision, Miller versus Alabama, where they created parole eligibility for juveniles. I was testifying at a Senate hearing. We were there for like 3 hours. And one of the legislators got frustrated because he was like, everybody talking about this, and nobody, I didn't hear one person say anything about the victim. And so I raised my hand up and said, come on if you got something to say, you know, in a kind of like arrogant way. And when I sit down, I said, first of all, I need to ask you, what does a victim look like? And he kind of like, you know, all white men, and they were kind of like, had this kind of peculiar look on his face. And then I started telling the story, and I told the story about, I lost a son and a future daughter-in-law in a domestic situation where a former boyfriend killed both of them. But I'm here today because in a fair and just society, we can't base laws on the way we feel at the worst moment of our life. And it took all the air out the room, because first, they didn't see me as being a victim of anything. And so I think that's how we approach this healing piece about who needs to be healed. We don't have clinics in the hood. We can't afford to go lay on somebody's sofa. I tell people all the time, I'm okay if you're okay, but I ain't never laid on nobody's sofa. And I know that almost 30 years done something to me. But nobody didn't say, hey, welcome to my sofa, let's talk about this. So the healing is really left up to us to try to heal ourselves, try to heal people, or reconcile with the harm that's been caused to us, the harm that some of us have caused to other people. And so I just try to like suggest to people all the time is that, to me it's simple. When you look in the mirror in the morning, nobody leaves out the mirror before you reconcile with what they see. If your lipstick not straight, you're not leaving out that mirror. If your eyelashes not straight, your hair not straight, you're not leaving out the mirror. And that's the same thing with this hurt and this harm that we feel. We got to reckon with that, but we have to reconcile with it within ourselves first, and then once we heal ourselves, then we can kind of like be in a position to help other people heal or extend that hand to them. But it kind of like what it looks like, what this healing process looks like, and who are people willing to help heal. Because people coming out of prison, yeah, I want people to get out of prison, but people just can't walk out the door because people bring in all that trauma with them that has never been addressed. And when something happened, somebody say, oh, I told you, they ain't learned their lesson. But nobody done anything to help them heal. And so we got to find the way that we reconcile with how we deal with things in our communities and what that healing looks like. You know, when I was a little kid, everybody in the neighborhood had carte blanche. If they saw me doing something I had no business doing, touch me up, send me home. And they would call ahead of time. I touched them up, I'm sending them home. And when I got to the door, my grandma was in the door with a belt. You see what I'm saying? But that was the kind of like the value added, that somebody saw something in us to kind of like try to help right But I don't see people caring enough about folks now. It's like this is a cold town, and I'm not talking about cold because of the weather. I come out the South. You pass people, it's good morning, good evening, yes ma'am, no sir, how you doing? You know, I've been passing people walking every day, and I'll be like, good morning, and people look at me. I know he's not from here, you know? I mean, I'm in close proximity with people in the elevator, and I'm like, good morning. And I'm like, you ain't got nowhere to run. You need to speak to me. And these folks wouldn't say anything. And I'm like, okay, I got it, you know? But so it's just how we have been conditioned over time to do the little simplest things of these courtesies to each other that start these healing processes, you know? Going into spaces where you know there's trauma, like you say, again, the little kids don't know that you were impacted. You were kind of like in a minute, I don't even know if I want to share this, but the minute you did it, you felt good, and they felt good now because like, here's somebody that identifies with us 100%. You know, the effort that y'all put in with changing their language about when you come out, this is how you present yourself. All that is a part of healing and helping people heal. Because one of the things with folks is that folks feel bad about what they have done, and they don't know how to step back into spaces and say, I am sorry. Because in most places, I go to a lot of parole and pardon hearings, and the first thing I hear the crime survivors say, well, he never said he was sorry. And then you have to remind them that there's a law on the book that says if he get in contact with you, he's going to get some more time. Right. And then when those crime survivors hear that, it kind of like just break them all the way down because they realize here's somebody wanting to say, I'm sorry 30 years ago, and this is the first opportunity they've gotten. Yeah. And so we have to kind of like educate ourselves about what this looks like and what we're looking for. Are we looking for somebody just to say, I'm sorry? Are we looking for somebody, restitution from people? We need to let people know what is that expectation of them.
So we've talked a little bit about harm and trauma and healing. We haven't talked about accountability and what accountability looks like on both sides of the coin. And in particular, what accountability looks like. So we touched on what the fact that the criminal justice system and those who are leading that work aren't necessarily trained to talk about trauma and healing, et cetera. But what about the role that they play in terms of accountability and their accountability to the people who they are serving, the people who are most impacted by the justice system? What does that look like in terms of the role that, that they play in accountability? Brian.
That's a hard one. I think that, to me, it's what accountability looks like is that, okay, one of the reoccurring themes that I see across the board in any institution that I work in, whether it's a juvenile facility, an adult male facility, or a women's facility, is that there are people that just need mental health help, and a lot of people that need mental health help. And honestly, the folks that work in these prisons as administrators have had this dumped in their lap in a lot of cases, and they know they're not equipped to deal with that because they don't have the resources. So, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind with me is that as a society, we have to stop trying to deal with mental health problems inside of prison walls. We have to get help for folks on the outside. And until we start doing that, we're just going to keep having these issues. So.
Thanks. Norris is reminding me of a conversation we had yesterday, yesterday at State Vote, but it also brought me back to a conversation I had maybe 10 or more years ago with a group of folks at Danville Prison. I was teaching community college class there, and somebody asked me to start a reading group, and so we started reading books together, and they chose the books, etc. But one thing that came up in that reading group, which really was kind of like a seed for me for many other things, is that people talked about the structural barriers to being accountable to people who they harmed, because the state doesn't allow that. And so they talked about how, you know, that even in the laws, it's like the state that holds them, the state that is saying that they did something wrong, not even the person. They don't get to hear from the family members. And this man said, you know, I took someone's son and I took someone's father. You know, I need to apologize to them, and I want my life to be accountable going forward to this person. And but there's no way. And so, you know, these kinds of things are rife throughout the system, where so much is removed from people that they're not able to articulate their, you know, autonomy and righting the harms, you know. So
I'm going to ask one final question before we open it up to the audience Q&A. And that is, we talked a lot about the conversation and narrative change, but how do we actually measure progress? And how do we move from the conversations and narrative change to actual policy change and systemic change in the systems?
It's $1 million question. I think in the juvenile side, is with my experience, that's the hardest one to overcome. Right now, we're in a space where I'm calling it, we are in hope, in, you know, without data, right? We try to believe that the things that we're doing are making change because we don't have the data yet to back it up. And a lot of that is because, you know, there's, once youth are released from a facility, though there's like kind of a system in place, the two sides don't really talk to each other. So we don't know how well these youth are doing outside. And I feel like until we can kind of bridge that gap and understand, okay, this youth was released here and now he's here, he's going to college, he's doing this, this, and that, until we have that kind of data to see how the youth are doing, it's a tough one to answer. But I think that's the place to start. I think it's about getting data on what happens after release and to see what's working and what's not.
I think for us in Louisiana, we have led the nation per capita incarceration for the last 40 years. And then the last year and a half, we've moved from number 1 to number 2. All through just one legislative process with people acknowledging the unjust laws that they have put in place. But it was based on data. It was based on this shop coming in, the people from Pew came in, did an assessment of all the DOC data about who we actually had in prison and why they were there. And then people was like, oops, Emperor has no clothes on. And then they were able to reconcile with, we've been putting people in jail for willy-nilly. And so that to me is like, took us 40 years to get to that spot, maybe longer than that. But in one legislative session, we turned all of that around. And so that's progress in a sense because you can measure it. But like you're saying again, is that we are blessed in the sense that we have relationship with the Department of Corrections that literally share data. Because if somebody does something, they're going to get blamed for it. So it's advantageous to them to help those people succeed. And so we're able to help them track people that get out about this is what this person is doing 3, 4, 5 years later. Probationist parole has become really user-friendly in a sense of, as opposed to always looking at people to put them back in jail, they're looking to keep people out of jail. And so to me, that is like a sea change because that wasn't their role long ago. They were just like the auxiliary cops. But now they're actually people who are trying to provide services for people to help people sustain themselves once they're released. So I see that as, but that's not happening nationally. That just happened in that little one-horse town I'm from. And, you know, Louisiana's a small state, 4.5 million people. So, you know, you blink, you can pass through us. But in comparison, if we can do that in the South, in a place that's always showing up 49 or 50 in every category, certainly places that's more progressive than we are should be able to start seeing change and start to demand change. I tell people we got to stop showing up with hat in hand, you know, give me, let me, can you spare? We got to start making demands on the system that it actually do the things that, I ain't gonna say the thing it was designed to do, because it's doing that perfectly well, but the things that we need it to do. You know, but that only gonna come if we start making demands upon the system.
I'd like to invite Nicole to join us on stage for the Q&A. So our first question from the audience is, I recently read a story in the Chicago Tribune about how certain prisons in the state banned certain books that inmates could read and limited the number of books to 3 that could be kept by inmates. What can be done about this? No education, no rehabilitation.
Well, there's a campaign we're starting, and you can do that. So basically, the state of Illinois spent $300-some last year on books for the whole entire state, which is 25 state prisons, adult state prisons. And the legislature took out books out of the budget, I think back in 2002. Now, people have to have law books because it's a federal law, but books themselves have been hard to find in prison, and it's really through volunteer groups like Books to Prisoners and education projects that have been getting books in, and families, largely families. Like several years ago, we did a survey of all the librarians in state prisons, and we asked where they got their books from, and it was often from folks inside prison, right? They would donate books to the library. Since in the summer, Danville Correctional Center, which is outside of Champaign-Urbana, took out about 200 books out of their prison library. They were all African American history, reentry books, et cetera. And there is a legislative hearing later in the summer about it. And from that, we're starting a campaign called Freedom to Learn. And censorship of books is just one piece of it, because we do have an issue in the state of Illinois where access to education in prison is pretty uneven across the state. Also, too, there's basic things like formerly incarcerated people who have PhDs and amazing credentials can't come back in and teach. It's up to the warden at each prison. Like, this is ridiculous. These are the people that actually should and want to be back in there to support folks inside. Other rules are that when people get out and they're on probation or parole, actually, we don't have parole in the state of Illinois, so I want to erase what I just said. We have something called mandatory supervised release. We don't have parole, so people have sentences of 35 years. They have to do all 35. But people, when they get out, they could be going to college, but they don't get any sort of good time off of their mandatory supervised release. So it's those kinds of sort of pieces of legislation we're hoping to move with Department of Corrections through administrative directives collaboratively, or if that can't happen, then through a legislative process. So we're working on it. If you want to know more, go to the freedomtolearn.net website. That's a good plug. Thanks, whoever asked that question.
How do you envision art should or can be used to open access to folks of limited literacy? Thinking of my sharecropper turned factory worker granddad.
Well, I think something that always amazes me anytime that I end up, like for instance, when I've been working with Jason, is the incredible visual literacy that the students have that we work with. And I have found that in general, and it's cliche, but art is a universal language that folks, no matter what background they come from, it's something that they can understand, it's something that affects them in an emotional manner. So I think the arts is, to me, it's the most powerful way that we can all speak the same language.
Can I ask a question? Sorry. Nicole, you included poetry by really beautiful, amazing poets in your piece, and I was just wondering if, like, maybe that question, like how that came about as using art in that work.
Sure.
I didn't plug her either to do that.
Art is definitely not my area of expertise. And the idea to do the creative works actually came from the editor-in-chief, Jake Silverstein, whose own father is a poet. And it really came out of conversations we were having about how Black Americans are the only group in the history of our nation for whom it was at one time illegal to read and write, and what that means about the ability to have a written record of so many things that happened to Black people throughout history, where if there is a written record, it has been written by white people. And so the idea kind of came that we could reimagine these moments in time and allow Black people to tell stories that where often we were not allowed to have a written record of them. And I think it was also, so part of the project is also original works of art, also by Black artists, to illustrate every piece in the magazine is illustrated by an original piece of art that we commissioned to go with the piece. And all of them together are telling a story both visually and in terms of the word, but also in terms of the contributors, that it was the descendants of the enslaved who were contributing all of these pieces, and the fact that they were in a position to be amongst the most laureled writers, the most laureled artists of our time, also spoke to the ascendancy, and we hope that that would send an empowering message as well.
It definitely did. So the next question is, how do we change the narrative in a way that shifts more power to the most impacted people, especially in a world where even stories are being monetized and plundered for profit?
Will you repeat the question?
Yes, sir. How do we change the narrative in a way that shifts more power to the most impacted people, especially in a world where even stories are being monetized and plundered for profit?
Well, I think one of the things is kind of like what's going on now. Folks are disinvesting in things that are taking advantage of the people's history. And I think that's one of the things, how people have built everything. I mean, this country was built on the backs of folks who labor long and hard. You know, when you think about Nicole's project, 20 people, but you look at what this country has built from 20 people, and so it's how we literally kind of like start shifting that frame and questioning. It's like, people invest in a lot of things. It's like, okay, well, what are you actually investing my dollars in? Is my dollars being invested to keep this system going the way it's going? Like in the prison industry, people, the telephone company, telephone companies making real money off of people being in prison. And nobody sees it that way, but these same cell phones we got in our pocket, AT&T, T-Mobile, whoever we got, it's like they got some subsidiary of their company that's running prison telephones where they are kind of like charging people enormous rates just to stay in touch with their loved ones. And so how do we call those people out? Do we shut our phone off for one day? Everybody got unlimited minutes, so that wouldn't help. But how do we send a message to these people that it's time for y'all to stop making money off the backs of people who have been marginalized and can't afford to do it? And that goes across every area, housing and everything else, because, with housing, it's really impactful because most neighborhoods, people can't even afford to stay in them anymore, primarily because people see their land as some waterfront property, and so it's like, how do we start having a conversation with people about, and the people who allow them to do that, it's kind of like the legislators, city council people who pass these ordinances that allow this area to be zoned a certain way. And so how do we start having that corrective behavior conversation with those folks about, hey, we're marginalizing people. It's almost like the story about the $1 million blocks. They have tracked how many people have been pulled out of this community that costs the state $1 million to keep them incarcerated. But when people start doing the overlay maps on top of them about, well, how much was invested in this community? Nothing. And so these are kind of conversations we got to start having with people about, it just can't be a one-side conversation about, we can make money, but at whose expense?
Yeah. Two-part question, starting with you, Nicole, we talked a little bit about the power of language, and it seems you made a choice to talk about enslaved people versus slaves throughout the piece. So if you can talk about that choice in the 1619 project and whether there was any pushback from the editors. And then the second part of the question is, what role does historical trauma play in this conversation, and how can we use this narrative creative process to bring insight and awareness of this trauma to encourage accountability and social responsibility toward change?
So I think it speaks to, I think, how rarely we see the type of project that the 1619 project is, that every place I go, people want to know about the pushback, right? There's an assumption that I would have faced pushback in pitching this, and generally that assumption would be correct, but I did not, really in no aspect of the project at all. Language, of course, we're journalists, we're writers, so language is very important. And I thought it was extremely important that we have a uniform way of referring to people who were enslaved. I think calling our ancestors slaves, of course, is dehumanizing. It speaks to who you are, not a condition. And when you modify the word people with enslaved, then you speak of a condition that was not actually about the humanity of those people. I think a lot about, in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court said that black people, whether enslaved or free, came from a slave race. And because they came from a slave race, that meant that even once they gained their freedom, they still could never be citizens of the country of their birth. So I was thinking a lot about that, and I actually developed really a miniature style guide that we sent out to all of the editors on the project that basically said, if you see the word slave and it's not in quotations, you need to strike that and replace it with enslaved. Similar things about kind of these benign words like plantation. Well, these were slave labor camps. These were forced labor camps. We need to call them what they were. When you call Monticello a plantation, you can have this gauzy view of this kind of beautiful, whatever. That is, of course, only exists and was literally built by people who were forced to labor through torture. And so that language was important to us. You will never see the word black or blacks appear as a noun. We don't refer, to me, one of the most grating things is when someone says the blacks did this or blacks did that. So black could only be used as an adjective, and that had to be throughout the entire project. We read for that when we were editing. And the worst thing to me would be to have produced something that further dehumanized people who for 400 years have been fighting to have their full humanity recognized, and that was very critical.
I think we're going to end on that note. Again, I want to thank all of our panelists today. Jason, Brian, Norris, Sarah, thank you for joining us. Nicole, thank you for bringing this beautiful 1619 project into the world. And thank you for our hosts this evening, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, the Pulitzer Center, Illinois Humanities, and Envisioning Justice. Thank you all, and good night.